Jim Edgar, by the way, is one of the few politicians who exercised term limits on his own. He decided voluntarily not to run for a third term as governor, but I would argue that there was only one vote there that mattered, and that was the vote of Brenda Edgar. So I think that was a one-person majority there. No, okay, he's disabusing me of the notion. A quick story. This was the summer of 1997, and Governor Edgar was close to finishing his second term, and the speculation back then, as you may recall, was whether he would run for a third term or run for the U.S. Senate. There was a strong push that year to get him to run for Senate, and we were all kind of waiting for the decision. The one that ended up being made was that he was not going to run for either, which was not what I thought would happen, but it was a health issue, and it was probably a smart decision. But the state fair was in August of that summer, and the governor was still hanging. We were all hanging and waiting. So I couldn't resist a story that I did from the state fair. I went down the midway of the fair, and there was a fortune teller. So I went into the booth of the fortune teller, and I said, I figured we'd make a story out of this. I went with my cameraman, and we took all the video. I told the fortune teller that we couldn't decide, was he going to run for governor? Was he going to run for Senate? Was he not going to run at all? And the fortune teller, looked in her crystal ball and looked me in the eye and said, he is running for the Senate. And so, of course, the story that day was that Jim Edgar, according to the fortune teller, was running for the Senate. So he was perfectly happy to prove me wrong, the fortune teller wrong, and all the other seers wrong. As you know, Secretary of State, two-term governor, state of Illinois, now very active with his own foundation, helping young people, helping people get into the political world for the right reasons and do it the right way. And I would say that, the bar is fairly low, but Jim Edgar can claim proudly that in the last group of governors of the state of Illinois, he certainly was the one that was most honest and most on the job and really trying to run the state for the right reasons. So, and lastly, I have no idea where he stands on term limits because we asked him to speak without asking him to tell us in advance. I have suspicions, but he's going to share some thoughts on that and other things. So, Jim Edgar.
Well, thank you, Andy. I just wish you'd have said that when you were on air. All those years.
I wasn't allowed to.
Yeah, but thank you. It was a very kind introduction. I really been looking forward for years to kind of get my day to talk about Andy, because halfway through my Secretary of State, he went to ABC and started covering politics, and then all the time I was governor, every night he had a comment about my governorship. Sometimes they were okay, and sometimes they weren't okay. But I never took them personal, and I hope he doesn't take my comments about him personal either. I first met Andy actually when he was doing editorials for Channel 5. And I remember there was going to be a mayoral election in Chicago, and there was going to be a primary. That actually mattered back then, a little bit. And Andy planned to do editorials on the campaign. And they were going to, Channel 5 would pick somebody. Well, Channel 5 decided they were not going to pick somebody in that campaign. Well, Andy, true to his convictions, and I admire him for this to an extent, he was quoted in the paper questioning the wisdom of the management of Channel 5 for not having the fortitude to, and it was a lot more blunt than that, let me say, at least the quote was, about not picking a candidate. Well, within 2 days, Andy was at ABC, Channel 7, and then started back up the ladder and became a very competent reporter, and I enjoyed dealing with Andy. Didn't always like his stories, but I enjoyed dealing with him. My last story on Andy. Now, while I thought he showed a lot of fortitude and moral conviction on the editorial thing, even if it cost him a job, he wasn't always right. In 1990, I was engaged in a very close and tough race with Neil Hartigan, the Attorney General, for governor. And the last day before the election, we do the traditional fly around. Then we have the election watch at our wherever. Well, I noticed Andy wasn't with us on the fly around. And I said, what happened? And there was somebody else from ABC. And Andy had the choice. I knew he was the lead political guy. He'd be able to. And they said, well, Andy decided Hartigan's going to win. And he's flying around with him, and he's going to be at his headquarters election night. Well, I was so happy when it finally came in, election returns, and it was well after midnight. Andy wasn't seen on TV. It was this kind of the second guy who was over at our headquarters. I've never let Andy forget that. But that's really the last time I think Andy's made a real bad decision. I think his leadership of the BGA has been outstanding. When I first broke into state government in the late 60s, the BGA was a force in affecting public policy in Illinois. And it really had kind of lost that until Andy came back a few years ago. I remember talking to him, and he said he was going to take this job, and I kind of questioned his sanity and decided ABC must not have much of a pension plan. But I think he's done an outstanding job, and I compliment you on that very much, Andy. Also, David Yepsen, who I thought was going to introduce me, and I was a little scared when Andy was going to do it because I wasn't sure what he was going to say. I also want to commend David on the job he's done at the Simon Institute. You know, he had to follow a person named Mike Lawrence. And those of you in the room who don't know who Mike Lawrence was, before he headed up the Simon Institute, he was my press secretary. And I know how difficult it is to find somebody to follow Mike Lawrence. But I think the Simon Institute did an excellent job in picking David, and he's done a great job in continuing to make that institute really, again, a factor in public policy in Illinois. And last but not least, the Union League Club. And to you, David, I want to thank you for your involvement. Now, the Union League Club really goes back farther in my being than either one of these other two gentlemen, because I used to get to come here as a treat. When I was first starting out as a legislative staffer back in 69 and 70, I worked for a gentleman I'm going to mention a little later, W. Russell Arrington. And I'm still scared of him, and he's been gone for 30 years. But for a treat, he would bring the staff over to the Union League Club, because he was a very active member here, and we would have lunch. And this was the highest reward you could get working for Senator Arrington, for him to bring you to the Union League Club. So I've always had a special place in my heart for the Union League Club, and now I'm a member. Feel like I've made it in life. Heck with those other clubs. So I was really excited when Andy invited me to come and be the luncheon speaker, because that's a big deal. I'm going to be the luncheon speaker at a meeting at the Union League Club. And then I saw the program, and both breakfast and lunch you got for $15. And I thought, you know, what kind of luncheon is this? But I must say, somebody's losing money here, because that is I thought you had a very good spread for lunch. Yeah, okay, well, hopefully not from the University of Illinois. Okay. All right, that's enough. But anyway, I want to thank all three of you and your organizations for putting this on and for being active in public policy and trying to help the process. We need more people outside of government who will take a constructive approach and try to help make government more effective. Okay, disclaimer. I do work for the IGPA, but I'm not here speaking for the IGPA, so I do have opinions. And these are my opinions. They're not the IGPA's, not the University of Illinois. President of the university gets very nervous every time there's an election and I start getting vocal. But academic freedom, and that's what I'm going to use here today. Secondly, my comments on term limits really apply to the state legislature. And I think that's what this constitutional amendment's about. It's not about city council, which maybe does need term limits or an IQ test or something. And I can't speak for Congress, and it does strike me from afar that those people do stay for a long time. But I'm going to talk about my view on Springfield and whether I think it's good or not. When Andy first called me, I thought, you know, I don't really have strong feelings on term limits. When it first came up in the 90s, I didn't think it was a very good idea. I just have always thought that really the electorate ought to determine how long a person, particularly in the legislature, stays in office. And one of the reasons I've never been excited about term limits for the legislative branch of government is that I think the legislative branch of government, in this balance of power, which I think is very important to make our system work, they provide the longevity. They provide the historical perspective on government. A governor usually comes on the scene, then leaves, while legislators stay for a long time. And I think that balance works pretty well, because I expect the executive branch, particularly the governor, to come in with some fresh ideas. Probably most of them have been tried before, and the legislators know that, and they'll have to explain that to him. But sometimes that time has come for that new ideal. So that balance, I think, works pretty well. If everybody was new on the job, or pretty new, I'm not sure we would get the best results. So that's one of the reasons I've always been rather apprehensive about term limits. The other was because my mentor, people always say, who's your mentor? Well, my mentor in government was W. Russell Arrington, who was the Senate Republican leader. Back then they were called the President Pro Tem because the Lieutenant Governor still presided in the Senate, but he was the power. Mike Madigan is the Russ Arrington of today, at least all the good things about Mike Madigan. Russ Arrington made the modern legislature, brought it into the 20th century, and made it a co-equal with the executive branch of government. Now, if they'd had term limits, he'd have never been leader, because he was in the legislature 20 years before the Young Turks threw out the old guard and decided they wanted somebody with some experience, and they brought in Russ Arrington as a surprise to everyone, and then he completely changed the whole legislative process in Springfield. That wouldn't have happened if we'd have had term limits. So again, I've always been a little apprehensive on term limits for the Illinois legislature. Now, since the 90s, we've had states adopted, and we've had studies, and Carl, I guess he didn't hold up the book that he, along with some others, published a few years ago and worked on, and I think was very good, that I actually read the other day. One of the few pamphlets out of a not-for-profit I've probably read all the way through, but on term limits. And reading through that, and they kind of put both sides in with, but I think if you look at the facts, it reassured me that probably term limits weren't what we needed in Illinois. One of the things that surprised me a little bit, I hadn't thought about before, that term limits really would shift the power more to the executive branch of government. Now, I can see, as someone who wants to be governor, or is governor, term limits might have their pluses. In fact, I have to be very candid. There were days when I was governor, I didn't want term limits, I just wanted to abolish the whole institution of the Illinois General Assembly. But as I reflect back, it was probably good they were there, because while usually I was right, I wasn't always right. And sometimes Mike Madigan actually might have been right, not very often, but sometimes. But more importantly, Mike Madigan and Jim Edgar together often could come up with the right solution. And I think that balance is needed. I think the problem today isn't the legislature stays too long. It's the legislature and the governor can't sit down and kind of work things out. And one of the things I was thinking about too, if you had a turnover of legislators pretty rapidly, I just think in Congress, I'm not sure if I was the president or if I was the governor dealing with equivalent, I'd much rather deal with Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy than I would Ted Cruz and the Tea Party group. I just think to get things done, one of the things that's very true, I think the study showed, and I just want to reemphasize it here, a lot of times when people are new in the legislative process, and I was the same way, I've got all the answers. And everything that's been done before is wrong, and we need to change it all. And I want it my way. The word compromise or finding a common ground just really doesn't enter into it. Now, after a few years, you begin to realize, hey, there's other people here that come from other parts of the state with different ideology, with different points of view. And after a while, you realize, well, they're not always wrong, and I'm not always right. And that ability to work together to find the common ground, to me, is the the key to making a democracy work. And I worry that if we have a rapid turnover in Springfield, in the legislative branch, and we usually get a new governor, well, recently we've been getting them a lot quicker than we have in the past for a variety of reasons, but let's say every 8 years. I just think we need more of a balance. And again, I'm not sure term limits would allow us to have that balance we need. Now, as was true in many of the other major states where you saw term limits implemented, it really wasn't driven because legislators have stayed too long. And I think in Illinois, we have a pretty good turnover between elections and redistricting, and I also want to touch on redistricting in a minute. We do get a turnover. Maybe not as much as we would with term limits, but still there's a turnover. The problem in Illinois, as it was in some of these other states, is not the rank and file. It's we've had one person as speaker now for, 30 years? I swore him in 30 years ago as speaker when I was Secretary of State, except for 2 years. And if Mike Madigan was not the speaker, I do not think we would be having this conference today. I don't think maybe that constitutional amendment would even been thought of, or wouldn't be going as well as it's going. So perhaps we need to look at what the problem is. Is the problem the speaker's been there too long? And I think you can make a case. Anybody can be someplace too long when they have that much power. A governor, as mentioned, I voluntarily stepped down after 2 terms. I was tired. I was worn out after 2 terms. It wasn't just my heart. Actually, the doctors told me I could stay, though they thought the Senate would be a better place. They said it's kind of like a halfway house. But if I wanted to run for governor, and I would like to try to put to rest forever. Brenda did not talk me out of running for governor in 1998 or in 2006. Brenda's much smarter than to tell me that. I knew what Brenda thought, but Brenda left it up to me because she said, if I make you do something and you don't want to do it, then I've got to live with you for the next 20 years, and it's not going to be a pretty sight. So she did not try to sit. But I actually was tired. I think you can make a case for term limits when it comes to the executive branch of government. Again, maybe it can apply to the mayor of Chicago. I don't think there's any doubt that the longer you're in at that level, when you have that much power, you do begin to believe your own press releases. You do think that you're infallible. And perhaps the speaker or the presiding officers, you might make a case that after 10 years or whatever, it's probably time for a change. I think we've only had one, and that's been Speaker Madigan. And I have to tell you, I dealt with Madigan, and I fought with Madigan. In fact, I had bypass surgery, and 2 of the bypasses was because of Mike Madigan. One was Medicaid, and I think the other might have been paid Phillip. But Mike Madigan is the smartest guy I dealt with in Springfield. I always said when I was in Springfield, he was the smartest guy in Springfield. And he was a tough guy. So I don't think we ought to just change our Constitution because some people think Mike Madigan's been there too long. And then the other thing I realized, even if we do this, we're going to have Mike Madigan for 8 more years. Good heavens, he's going to be 81? Is that what the age is? I mean, eventually Mike Madigan will leave on his own. I'm convinced if you pass this, he'll stay for 8 years just to spite everybody. Now, I know that politically, the people, if you ask the people, they want this. Just as they wanted to do away with the cumulative voting. You know, we had a wannabe governor back then named Pat Quinn who pushed that through. We now have a wannabe governor, Bruce Rauner, who's pushing this one. And I got to say, it is smart politics. I don't think, though, it's very good government. Just as the cumulative voting turned out, I don't think to be doing away with that. And people voted to do away with cumulative voting, but not because they didn't understand or care about cumulative voting. They were going to get rid of 59 politicians. That's why it passed. And this time, I think the same is true. Most people are going to vote for this, and I think they will vote for it, because they just want to get rid of some politicians. And while I understand that politically, governmentally, I don't think that's the best long-term for the state. The other thing I would caution everyone, we don't know for sure what will happen. We know there will be a change. Might be better, might be worse. We could sit, and that's what part of this discussion is about today. But it will be somewhat chaos. And the last thing Illinois state government needs is any more chaos. We need some stability. We need some, let's get this ship back on track. I'm not convinced this does it. I really think that if we want meaningful reform, it's not the cutback amendment. I think the key is changing the way we redistrict in this state. And I've worked on reapportionment, and I used to think there's no other way to do it than the way it's set up. I've come to the conclusion we need to change that. That's really, I think, what's caused more of the problem than some legislators have stayed too long. It's the fact that on Election Day, we don't often have a choice. There's often no competition because these legislative districts are drawn where they're all Republican or they're all Democrat. And if you didn't vote in the primary, and a lot of people don't vote in the primary because one thing, we have primaries way too early in this state. At least this year it wasn't Groundhog Day. We did move it back to March, but we ought to be in the summer like most other states, and people maybe would be more involved in primaries. But we also ought to have districts in this state where there's actually some question on Election Day. We call them swing districts. That means you have a good number of Republicans and Democrats in those districts, and that means a candidate has to appeal to more than just a few people who show up at a primary on whether they're going to be elected or reelected. So to me, the most meaningful reform we could do in Illinois is not the cutback amendment, which makes me nervous. I'm not sure it's as Carl Kurtz pointed out, it really didn't change as much as some people thought it would change. But right now, I don't think Illinois needs any instability. We need some stability in state government. But I do believe that the redistricting process needs to be overhauled. I don't think we ought to have all these safe districts and everything decided in a primary in the dead of winter when just a few people show up. I think we ought to have elections mean something in November for the legislature. And also, if a legislator knew they had to not only appeal to a few people in a primary who have a tendency to be kind of to the extreme of their party in both parties in the primary, but they had to appeal to both Republicans and Democrats and independents to get elected, I think, again, state government would work a lot better. I think we would find it much more probable that we would find common ground, that we wouldn't pit downstate against Chicago. Republicans and Democrats actually would know each other and speak to each other. So that, to me, is the real reform we need in Illinois. I'm afraid this might set us back. I'm not convinced it'll do all the wonderful things that people think it will do unless you do want chaos even more in Springfield. It's hard to believe there could be more chaos in Springfield than there is, but it could happen. And if you really want a legislature that's not an equal partner with the executive branch, I really believe we need that equal partner. We need that balance of power that really is part of the essential of a democracy. So with that, let me stop. I'll be happy. You want me to take questions? I'm more than happy. Take any questions you might have. Mm-hmm. You moved. You were over here earlier, weren't you? Yeah.
Governor, I'm interested, might be somewhat off topic, but I don't really think it is, your perspective on the pension mess. It seems like in the past, there's been a lot of common ground that have helped cause this problem over many years.
Well, there's no doubt that I think the legislature and the governor in the past made some mistakes on legislation. I think we also, and I'll include myself not on the legislation because I will defend what we signed when I was governor. We did have a problem when I was first governor. The policy of the previous administration had been not to fully fund. They would put in what they thought was necessary for payouts. And the first 3 years I was governor, we were basically bankrupt, and we didn't have the money to start doing it. The fourth year, we did, surprisingly, an election year, pass a pension reform proposal that Speaker Madigan and I agreed on. that my Democratic opponent, Don Clark Netsch, wanted to strangle Madigan for kind of taking away an issue for her in the general election. But it was a good proposal. It didn't solve all the problems, but it did require discipline. Unfortunately, that discipline didn't last. We didn't keep reviewing it as we were supposed to, and also not increase pension benefits as they did later on when he did an early retirement and did some things. No, there are times when everybody can get together and it's not good, but I would say more times than not, people have got to get together just to make government work. Again, you've got folks on the outside keeping an eye. The media plays a very important role in making a democracy work, in calling us to task. I love talking to journalism students at U of I. One reason I like to get to them before they ruin somebody's career. But also, as I tell them, I said, you are the fourth branch. You're not in the Constitution, but you are the fourth branch. So I think more times than not, we need folks to get together in elected office and try to find common ground. I think if you're worried they're going to find common ground that's really not good for the public, I think, again, the media plays a very important role in keeping an eye on that. I used to get up every morning and know when I was governor, I not only had to worry about the Democratic Party, I also had to worry about the Republican Party a lot. I knew I had to worry about the media too. My press secretary had a great line. Every morning I'd get up, my routine, I'd get up and get on the treadmill and I'd start thinking about the problems of the day, and I would usually, by the time I got done 30 minutes on the treadmill, I had a scheme figured out how I was going to deal with this problem, and it was a scheme. And by the time I hit the shower, I had it pretty well perfected, and I thought it worked pretty well. Well, I'd always walk over to the Capitol every morning, and I'd walk over and I'd be getting it all polished, ready, and I'd assemble my staff. And then I'd say it out loud. And I noticed when I said it out loud, it didn't just seem as good as when I was thinking about it in my mind. And my press secretary, Mike Lawrence, would be sitting there, and Mike was very diplomatic. He never said, "Governor, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard." Mike, he believed in job security. And Mike, he smoked a pipe, but you couldn't smoke in the Capitol, so he just chewed on it. And he said, "Well, Governor, that sounds real good. How do you think that's going to read on the front page of the Chicago Tribune?" And I thought, well, those people in the Tribune, it's not going to read very good. And that would kind of get me back down. And so again, that was part of the checks and balances that I really think is essential. But in no way do I want to suggest that an effective check and balance is the two parties or both sides can't get together and kind of reach a compromise. Because if that doesn't happen, and we've seen that in the last few years with one-party control, one-party rule, I don't think we get the best public policy. I think when both parties get together and compromise, and the media is watching, which means the public's informed, I think we get pretty good public policy. And I really think in the past we got pretty good public policy. Sometimes it took us a while to get there, and sometimes we made mistakes, but I think overall it worked pretty well. I don't think it's worked in the last few years, and I can appreciate people's frustration with Springfield. But I'm not convinced this is the solution. I think, if we changed how we drew those maps and made sure there was more competition on Election Day, I think we could go a long way in trying to make state government work better again.
Thank you, Governor. I appreciate your comments. Along the lines of the prior question, what are some steps that I think can be taken between non-for-profit organizations as private citizens as well as government agencies to really engage the electorate in a way that they might have been feeling a level of disengagement and kind of a malaise of not participating at the primary level, and with all the different layers of government that people have to really sift through, what are some steps that you believe can be taken on both sides to really re-engage the electorate?
Well, there's no doubt. I think the 28% figure, only 28% of people trust or have any confidence in Illinois state government. There's no doubt, I think, elected officials have to keep that in mind every day. And everything they do And I don't think most elected officials ever think they're going to do something illegal. But sometimes they do some outrageous things. They just do silly things. And they just got to stop doing that. And, you know, and I realize that they feel strongly on their convictions and sometimes their emotions get carried away, but they need to be, civility needs to return to government. It's not just Springfield, probably even more so in Washington, D.C. But I'm not here to talk about Washington, D.C. I'll leave that to other people to figure out. But civility, I think, is something. And so I think that we need to encourage that among public officials. It's as important as the ability to compromise, is that to be, you can disagree, but disagree in a civil way. One of the things I learned, the guy I'm disagreeing with today very well might be my ally tomorrow on another issue. And so you don't want to burn bridges. But I think if people in government were more civil, and I think the public would begin to have a higher impression of it. And if there's any doubt in your mind that what you might be doing might be crossing the line, don't do it. If it even gets close to it, don't do it, because, again, that's going to undercut public confidence in state officials. I always tell people, when I talk on leadership, one of the most important people, the people around you. Now, legislators don't have a huge staff. They're not like a governor. And so they don't maybe have as many people around them, but I was fortunate I had staff around me who were not afraid, in a very nice way, to try to bring me back down to earth and to keep my ego, you know, somewhat in reasonable size. I mean, it is a problem. Power corrupts, and absolute power absolutely corrupts. There's some truth to that. So you need people around you who will keep your feet on the ground. Now, I always had that when I went home. Brenda did not hesitate. But you need something more than just your spouse. You need people around you, and you need to make them know that they can, in a nice way, criticize some of your thoughts without you blowing up at them. Because there have been some public officials who I think have gotten in trouble because they didn't encourage their staff or didn't like their staff to tell them they were wrong. And we're all going to be wrong. And we don't like to hear it, but we need to be willing to hear it and not bite the head off of the person who's brave enough to tell us. Yes, ma'am. Okay, excuse me.
Actually, my question is both a campaigning and a governing question. We've all been through the Rauner primary campaign. And my two questions about campaigning and governor are, one, what would you consider as the most important campaign advice you can give to Rauner in his fall campaign? And secondly, in the context of what you said today, and in the context of Rauner's primary campaign, if Rauner is elected, what is the most important advice that you can give him?
Well, I hate to give the advice publicly. In fact, he did call, and he's going to come and talk to me in a couple of days, so I'll give him some advice. Well, one of the things, and I did election night, and we've all been through. I went through the Rauner campaign. I want to make clear I was on, the other campaign in that primary. I watched the Rauner campaign. Politically, it was very effective, his topic about we're going to shake Springfield up and kind of, he didn't say throw the bums out, but kind of implied that, and that was probably a pretty good strategy in the primary, in a Republican primary. I'm not sure that's a great strategy to govern by. And I think you always got to keep in mind when you're running that the goal is to govern. It's not just to win the election. And I tell this to students and people I talk to who are running, if you're just running so you can run for re-election, don't do it. It's not worth it. The pay's not that good. They're cutting back your pension. I mean, you're just not that good. But if you want to get something done, there's nothing better than public service. If you really want to have an impact on people, there's nothing better. So you got to keep that in mind when you're running, that you don't want to do something that's going to impede your ability to govern. And one of the things that's going to be very important for a Republican, if he's fortunate enough to be elected governor, whether he likes it or not, he's going to be dealing with the Democrat legislature. I mean, that map is drawn in such a way, there's no way they're going to lose control in this election. And so you're going to have to live with a Democratic-controlled legislature. And even if you get this passed, it doesn't take effect for a while. And you still, there's a balance of power. You've got to work with them. You can't go around them. And we've had governors try that. I remember Dan Walker. Didn't work. And, you know, it's far better to try to sit down and figure out where you can agree and find that common ground. But you can't do that if there's been a lack of civility. And this applies both ways, not just to the gubernatorial candidate, but also to the legislative leaders. You know, there's been a lot of speculation about how close he is to the mayor of Chicago. And I have to say that I had my difficulties with the mayor of Chicago when I was governor. And I wish we hadn't have disagreed, but I often had to say no, and that wasn't a word the mayor was used to. But I tried to always keep it civil. But there is a lot of comment about Rounders being pretty close to the mayor of Chicago, and I think that'd be a great asset. But it's far more important that the governor has a good working relationship with the speaker than with the mayor. And so I guess I would just say keep that in mind. That doesn't mean you don't disagree on issues, but be sure you don't let it sound personal. You keep it as civil as possible, because you're going to have to work with those individuals. And also, I must say, as a Republican, and it's even worse now than when I was governor. When I was running for governor, there weren't enough Republicans to elect me anything statewide in this state. You had to have independents and what I call thoughtful Democrats to be able to win. And that's even more true today. And so I think you got to keep that in mind. Again, a primary, particularly a small turnout primary as this was, you know, there's just a small group that kind of determines that. You go to the general election, it's a much broader group, and it's much more diverse. You're going to have to, you know, be able to win enough of those people who aren't normally Republicans to win. Now, I think Rounder's first steps were in the right direction. He very quickly held press conferences talking about Democrats who were for him, minorities who were for him, and that, to me, is what he's got to project in this campaign. But I also would be very careful about, you know, burning any bridges with people you're going to have to deal with once you're elected governor. Yes, sir.
Wait, till we get a mic.
Oh, okay.
Right over here.
Cynthia Schulze. Could you just comment on the other two parts of the term limits proposal here? The one about changing the districts to 41 senator districts and 123 representatives, and changing it so that there's a 2/3 vote.
Well, I really didn't. I hadn't seen it. I about fell out of my chair when I saw those, to be truthful. They are getting rid of politicians. I mean, it's the old kind of Quinn approach on the cumulative voting. You're reducing. I'm not sure why they're doing that, except you're getting rid of politicians, and that plays well. You know, I was a state representative. I started out in the legislative branch of government. In fact, I spent a year working with NCSL when I first started. So I've got some legislative roots. I have to tell you, though, after I went over the executive branch, I quickly saw the error of my past and realized the executive branch really will keep you safe at night. But the 2/3 definitely would be a huge shift in power to the governor. Huge shift. 3/5 is difficult to get in most cases, and I think is a reasonable number. 2/3, you know, any governor worth his salt should never get overridden with 2/3. I mean, the governor's got so many goodies, even in this day and age of change, that he could get enough legislators to have a sick son and they have to leave the session or whatever. 3/5, I mean, 3/5 is kind of what the 1970 Constitution put in, and I think I don't understand why we're changing that unless you just want to give more power to the governor. Reducing the size, I don't understand either. I will say, as a former state representative in downstate Illinois, you got to drive a lot farther to see people. If you go this way, a senator downstate needs to buy a plane. So I don't think it, you know, we're set up. We did reduce the House, you know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. No, I guess it's 30 years ago now. I'm not sure we need to reduce the legislature. As large and as diverse as the state is, I don't think the legislature is too big. So I don't see the need for those two. I was actually surprised. I didn't realize until he was going through that was in the proposal. I hadn't heard that much discussion about it.
Thank you, Governor.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Governor. Appreciate you taking time to be with us today. If we could have the members of the final panel up here in position while we'll get started. Been a lot of questions raised today. I think our final panel will help answer them. Both the Simon Institute and the BGA have researchers who look at policy questions for us. And in preparation for this symposium, we had some of our staffers examine some of these issues, and we'll present some of their findings today. Alex Gilewicz from the BGA, in the middle there, Alex. Alden Loury on the left from the BGA, and Paul Hale, who is our legal extern here at the Paul Simon Institute. I don't know who goes, have you guys decided who's going first? Okay, all right. Alden, Alex, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, David. Okay. Sorry, I'm shorter than most folks. Anyhow, again, Alden Loury, a senior policy analyst with the BGA.
And I'm Alex Gilewicz. I'm a policy associate also at the BGA.
So the title of our presentation is How Do We Get Here? And what the Better Government Association has done is really kind of taken a look at the black letter law in all 50 states across the country with regard to whether they have term limits, in what manner or form they have them, how long they are. And one area of focus in particular that we were interested in is how these term limits were implemented. And we think that there are some very interesting observations that we've made based on that. And again, looking at the black letter laws, actually going through the Constitution, the constitutional amendments that put these limits in place in practically all of the cases, and also looking at the actual ballot initiatives that help get many of those amendments on the ballot to be voted on by voters. One other area that we looked at is the presence of term limits on the local level. So we looked at the 20 largest cities in the United States, and we also took a look at a smattering of Illinois municipalities and the manner and form of term limits that they have. And the information was initially researched by two law students who were working with Kirkland and Ellis at the BGA in the summer of 2013. The bulk of that information was updated by Alex, and I helped a little bit with that as well.
So this has been discussed a few times today already, but when we see term limits implemented, they're implemented in one of two forms. There are absolute and consecutive limits. Absolute limits, also called lifetime limits, as Dr. Kurtz was referring to them before, are just that. They're limits on a legislator for the duration of their life. Once you serve your 8 years or your 12 years or your 2 terms, that is, you're ineligible to run for that office again. Consecutive limits, on the other hand, are once you serve your the length of the years or limits that are prescribed in the Term Limits Amendment. After a period of time post your term of service, usually 1 term or 4 years, you are re-eligible to run for that office again for the same length of time that you previously served, as though the clock has been reset on your service. Okay, so we're starting by looking at the executive limits on, or term limits on the executive at the state level. So for purposes of our discussion, we're looking at simply gubernatorial limits. Many states will also have limits on other statewide executive offices, like the lieutenant governor, like the treasurer, the comptroller, and they'll all be included in the same constitutional amendment or constitutional provision. But for our purposes, we're only looking at the position of the governor.
And as you can see, and this was mentioned by Dr. Mooney when he spoke earlier, most states in the United States have limits on their executive branch, and in this example, the governor. Almost 3 to 1, not quite, but a little more than 70% of the states have them. And as you can see, the states that do not have executive limits, there are a fair number of them in the Midwest there, including Illinois, Texas, New York, a few more out east, and then some states out west. But those states, in addition to not having executive term limits, they also do not have legislative term limits, which we'll see here in the next slide. You can see the map changes a great deal. While most states have executive term limits, most states do not have legislative term limits. And again, you see Illinois among the vast majority of states without legislative term limits across the country.
So in addition to the discrepancy between executive and legislative limits, there are also interesting discrepancies in how these limits were actually implemented on both the executive and legislative level. Just to give you an outline of the categories that we're looking at, the different modes in which limits have been implemented. The first category is by constitutional provision. So for us, that includes whether it was included in the original state constitution, whether it was included in a subsequent revision of the Constitution, in large part by a constitutional convention in which other reforms were also enacted, along with implementing term limits, or by another revision or amendment that we couldn't directly trace to a clear citizen initiative or legislative referendum, which are the next two categories. The initiative refers to a citizen ballot initiative, much like the one going on in Illinois right now, in which petitions are signed, votes are people gather signatures, and then it is placed on the or placed on the ballot rather, by the citizens. A referendum, an amendment is placed on the ballot by a legislature rather than by a citizen initiative.
All right, so taking a look at the variance of the ways in which the term limits have been implemented, and we have some double counting here because some of the states, as you see with the asterisk, they were initially imposed through what we defined as a constitutional provision, and then in a couple of cases they were updated by a ballot initiative or a referendum. You can see 19 states, and this is, again, executive term limits imposed by constitutional provision, and then you see the 10 states who've either imposed them or updated them through ballot initiative, and then the 9 states who did the same by referendum. And again, this again is based on a search of the black letter law that the Kirkland and Ellis law students did that we double checked last summer and again leading up to the event today. Looking at the legislative, and again you can see the vast change in terms of the number of states. But one of the things that clearly jumps out here is that most of these were implemented by ballot initiative put forward by voters, as Alex mentioned, similar to the ballot question that is presumably on its way to making the ballot here in Illinois. Only in 2 states were legislative limits imposed by referendum. Missouri updated legislative limits that were initially enacted by a voter initiative. All right, as was mentioned earlier, either by Dr. Kurtz or perhaps Dr. Mooney, in 6 states, term limits were, and these were legislative term limits, were either overturned or repealed by the legislature, or they were ruled unconstitutional by the courts. 4 of the states, they were ruled unconstitutional. Interesting to note that in 3 of those cases, I believe, the question was really about the manner in which the question was put forward, or in which the term limits were enacted. It was by, I believe it was a statutory measure rather than a constitutional amendment. And then in the 4th case, I believe the ballot question, there was a problem that the state Supreme Court found with the ballot question that led to term limits in that particular state.
So we've primarily been talking about term limits at the state level today. There's been brief mention of term limits being enacted at the local level, and we actually looked into that for the 20 largest cities in the United States. And we found that most of the 20 largest cities do have some form of term limits. And as was mentioned earlier, Chicago is the only one of the top 10 largest cities in the country that has neither mayoral nor city council limits. It's the only state, or the only city rather, of over a million people, I think, that has no limits of any kind. And as we can see, we've had a number of politicians who have availed themselves of this lack of limits. We have Richard M. Daley in office for 22 years, Richard J. Daley for 21, the longest serving alderman, still currently on the city council, just celebrated his 45th year in office, Alderman Ed Burke of the 14th Ward. So clearly availing themselves of this opportunity. And they've been as contentious at the local level as they have been on the state level. New York City has had a rather interesting tug of war for the last 20 years with enacting limits on the local level. They were approved by voter initiative in 1993, sort of reapproved in 1996 when there was an effort to extend them, and the voters rejected that effort, maintained a two-term limit. There's a rather famous case in 2008 when then Mayor Bloomberg, was about to leave office, managed to get City Council to approve an extension of term limits that was then later overturned in 2010. So with 3 times, voters in New York City have approved a two-term limit on their mayor and their City Council, back and forth for the last 20 years. It's been interesting at the local level as well as at the state level. So looking at where limits exist, just a quick run through. Absolute limits on the mayor exist in 6 cities, consecutive limits in 8 cities, none in 6 cities. Again, the next largest city after Chicago with no mayoral limits is Indianapolis. Quick view at the legislative limits, so on the city council. You really don't see the discrepancy between the executive and the legislature here that you do at the state level, which is interesting to note. The main difference is that Philadelphia has no limits on their city council while they do have limits on their mayor, but really not the same kind of, I think, very interesting difference that you do see at the state level.
And the 20 largest cities, excuse me, aren't the only cities that have term limits. We took just a very quick look at referenda since 1998 that has either on an advisory level or on a binding level imposed term limits. And so we just have a number of these cities, Des Plaines, Downers Grove, so on and so forth. Niles is an interesting case. Just last year, actually approved 2 different referenda that imposed limits, one put forward by the voters, another one put forward by the legislative branch, the council there in Niles, I believe, which is the one that will actually be honored there. Of the 13 referenda that we found on the Illinois State Board of Elections, using their information, 12 of those 13 binding or advisory referenda have passed since 1998. Again, another indicator of the vast popularity among voters for term limits. Lyons is one of the few places that abolished term limits. They did that actually in the primary this year. Our previous attempt back in 2006 had failed. So one of the other things we wanted to do was to kind of give a snapshot, and we've heard Mike Madigan's name a number of times today as the poster child for this conversation, and perhaps that we wouldn't even be here if not for Speaker Madigan's 40-plus years in office, and most of those in leadership, the last 27 years, I believe, consecutively as Speaker of the House after an interruption after his first couple of years in that role. But the other individuals who are also in leadership, Jim Durkin on the minority House side, and then, of course, the President of the Senate, John Cullerton, and then the Senate Minority Leader, Christine Radogno, all having been in office for a long period of time, particularly Cullerton, although none of them have actually been in leadership for a terribly long period of time. The average tenure of members of the General Assembly is about 8.5 years, based on our calculations of the current members in office now. And so you juxtapose that to the proposed 8-year lifetime limit, and you have an understanding of just how long people have been in office here in Illinois. To further illustrate that, we take a look at the current seating chart for the Illinois Senate. I see 59 members here. If that 8-year lifetime limit had been enacted 8 years ago, and this year would be the final year for any member of the Senate to serve based on that limit, we would lose 29 of the 59 members of the Illinois Senate. So it would have a very dramatic impact if it were imposed at one time here. But again, just an illustration to show the length of time that many of the Illinois senators have been in office. When we take a overlook at the House side, 118 members there, 49 of those members, if again 8 years ago term limits had been passed, the 49 individuals who have served about that long or longer in the Illinois House. Interestingly, while we talk about Illinois having been a place that has not been very open to the idea of term limits on some level, there has, in terms of the legislature, there actually has been a lot of interest among individual legislators to try to get term limits imposed. Currently, there are 16 proposed constitutional amendments that are active in the Illinois General Assembly, 11 originating in the House, 5 originating in the Senate. And again, it's really, these are proposed by a handful of lawmakers, and it's become almost a ritual for a few of them who will, because we look back at the 97 General Assembly and the 96 General Assembly, and it's pretty much the same story, about a dozen or so proposals that never went anywhere, never got out of the committee, never actually made it to a substantive vote. But some individuals will introduce a proposal for a constitutional amendment at the very early part of a session in the first 2-year cycle. That will go nowhere, and then at the beginning of the next year, they will introduce another constitutional amendment that again will go nowhere. Since 2010, in terms of leadership limits, which aren't here in Illinois either, only in a handful of states, with which you heard about earlier. Illinois, however, since 2010, has proposed more leadership limits through constitutional amendment than any other state. 16, I believe. New York is the next highest, has the next highest number with 10. And of course, as we've talked about on a number of occasions, there is a citizen-driven effort to try to get term limits on the ballot this November. So we say conclusions, question marks. These are more observations than anything else. This is a very kind of a difficult issue in order to kind of put your finger on whether you're talking about what the impact will be or actually in how these things actually come about. There doesn't seem to be any single approach to getting term limits enacted. As we've indicated and as you've heard of earlier today, limits vary widely in their length, of form, and as we've noted in how they actually are implemented. Legislative limits usually enacted by voter initiative. They're popular with voters, but not very popular with lawmakers. And then one other question, and I think Dr. Mooney said it very well. Ultimately, the decider who's going to decide whether there are term limits in Illinois may not be the voters at the ballot box or the legislature imposing them on themselves. It may ultimately be a question of the courts. And as we've seen, the courts have sometimes raised questions about whether or not limits are, at least the manner in which the limits are enacted, or constitutional. So there will likely be some type of question to deal with regard to the constitutionality of term limits here in Illinois. And with Alex and myself not being law students, but Paul Hale thankfully is, working with the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. Paul will pick up things from here and give you a deep dive into the available case law about term limits here in Illinois. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this year's Term Limits Symposium. My name is Paul Hale. I'm a second-year JD candidate at the Southern Illinois University School of Law, and I'm here on behalf of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. My presentation today will cover voter petitions for term limits in Illinois, a conflict between popular desire and constitutional constraints. First, an overview of the topics I will cover. First, which article of the Illinois Constitution applies to term limits? Second, the 3 methods available in the Illinois Constitution to possibly amend this article and implement term limits. Third, the Illinois Supreme Court places restrictions through their case law on the scope of these amendatory methods, particularly in the cases of Chicago Bar Association, the Illinois State Board of Elections, and Coalition for Political Honesty v. State Board of Elections. Finally, I will offer a prediction as to the likelihood of implementing term limits in Illinois. Term limits are at issue in Illinois, as we've heard throughout the day. Legislative term limits have long been a suggested means to solve perceived corruption and inaction in state legislative government. Paul Simon Public Policy Institute recent polling indicates that approximately 78% of Illinois voters would support term limits. Additionally, Republican governor candidate Bruce Rauner and the Committee for Legislative Reform and Term Limits have proposed a petition that could potentially place a term limits amendment before voters in the November 2014 election. Some components of the petition include reducing Senate seats from 59 to 41 and increasing House seats from 118 to 123 and implementing an 8-year legislative term limit. First, Article 4, Section 2C of the Illinois Constitution applies to term limits. The entirety of Article 4 comprises the legislative article of the Illinois Constitution. Specifically, Section 2C deals with the personal qualifications for legislative service. These qualifications include being a United States citizen, being at least 21 years or older, and a residency requirement. Adding legislative term limits language to this section would add an effective disqualifier to the list of qualifications needed to serve in the legislature. The Illinois Constitution provides 3 methods to amend articles of the Constitution and possibly implement term limits. They are contained in Article 14, Constitutional Revision. Article 14, Section 1 provides for a constitutional convention, or CONCON. Article 14, Section 2 provides for a General Assembly amendment. And Article 14, Section 3 provides for a voter initiative petition. Article 14, Section 1 explains the means by which a constitutional convention can be called. 3/5 of both houses of the General Assembly can agree to propose a constitutional convention to voters, or a constitutional convention is automatically proposed to voters if one is not proposed by the General Assembly on their own initiative over the course of 20 years. If voters approve of the constitutional convention, the convention will convene, and any amendments that flow forth from the constitutional convention are resubmitted to voters for their approval. If these amendments are approved, they are incorporated into our current Illinois Constitution. Article 14, Section 2 provides for and explains the means by which the General Assembly can propose an amendment. Again, 3/5 of both houses of the General Assembly can directly propose an amendment to voters without the use of a constitutional convention. This is limited, though, in that the General Assembly cannot propose changes to more than 3 articles of the Illinois Constitution in one election period. This limitation does not apply to other means of amending the Illinois Constitution. If voters approve of the proposed amendment, it is incorporated into the Illinois Constitution. And finally, Article 14, Section 3 provides for a voter initiative petition to the legislative article. The legislative article, which is Article 14, to reiterate, can be amended through the use of a voter petition. To be valid, a voter petition must obtain a number of signatures that is equal to or greater than 8% of the number of voters who voted for governor candidates in the previous gubernatorial election. If the requisite number of signatures is obtained, the subject matter of the voter petition must also be limited to structural and procedural changes to the legislative article only. It's important to note that the voter petition can only be used to change components of the legislative article, whereas our previous 2 methods can change any article. If the petition is valid, the petition will be submitted to voters and, if approved, incorporated into the Illinois Constitution. Now, which of these three methods is most likely to help initiate term limits in Illinois? Since 1970, there have been 21 amendment proposals to the Illinois Constitution. However, the General Assembly has never proposed a term limits petition on their own initiative. Therefore, it is likely that for term limits to be implemented in Illinois through a constitutional convention amendment, the voter initiative will have to be used. Illinois Supreme Court case law has offered some restrictions on the scope of voter petitions in previous decisions, particularly in the cases of Chicago Bar Association v. Illinois State Board of Elections, a 1994 decision, and Coalition for Political Honesty v. State Board of Elections, a 1980 decision. Chicago Bar Association is the paramount case when dealing with voter petitions and term limits. First, a factual background of this case. Voters drafted a voter petition. The number of signatures was acquired and not in question. The petition amended the legislative article, Section 2, to call for an 8-year legislative term limit. The petition added, and it's important to note that the petition added language, no person shall be eligible to serve as a member of the General Assembly for more than 8 years. The validity of this petition was challenged. Now, the court's legal analysis. The overall issue that the court addressed in this case is whether or not the voter petition for term limits was within the proper scope of the language of Article 14, Section 3, which provides for and explains the voter petition. Again, to reiterate, a voter petition must be limited to structural and procedural changes to the legislative article only. The court decided that the voter petition was not a structural change because affecting the eligibility of individual legislators does not change the overall composition of the General Assembly. The court also decided that the petition was not procedural because affecting, again, the eligibility of individual legislators does not change how the General Assembly makes law. The court also focuses in on the plain meaning and common usage of the word "and" to interpret that the structural and procedural requirement required both a petition to be both structural and procedural at the same time. This serves as another limitation on the scope of a voter petition. The court acknowledges that they're hedging their bets in this analysis by saying that even if we're incorrect and the voter petition is structural or procedural, it is certainly not both at the same time. For these reasons, the court invalidates the voter petition and it is never submitted to voters on the ballot. There is a dissent in this opinion. The dissenting justices feel that a term limits petition changes the composition of the legislature, which is well within the intended scope that the drafters intended when they drafted Article 14, Section 3. The court also disagrees with the construction of the word "and" determines that they should apply the "and" as an "or" and require a voter petition to be either structural or procedural and not both at the same time. The court also acknowledges that the general subject matter of term limits is not a substantive change to the legislative article and should be valid. There is a case where a voter petition was found to be valid, and this is Coalition for Political Honesty v. State Board of Elections. Again, the factual background of this case: a valid voter petition is drafted. The number of signatures is not in question. The amendment called for changes to the legislative article, sections 1 through 3, by calling for voter reform and abolishing multi-member legislative house districts. Among many changes that this amendment proposed, one particular important change that I think is very relevant to this analysis is the petition changed the language of the legislative article, section 1, to call for a reduction in House seats from 177 to 118. This is commonly referred to as the Cutback Amendment and was interestingly supported by our current governor, Patrick Quinn. The validity of this petition was also challenged. And what is the court's legal analysis and ruling? The court is very deferential to the validity of the voter petition in this case. The court acknowledges that a voter petition is a valuable check on legislative self-dealing and debilitating legislation, to use the words of the court. The court also acknowledges, however, that a voter petition must be limited in its scope to what the drafters intended. In this case, the voter petition was valid. However, the court acknowledges that a voter petition could potentially fall outside of this scope. The Cutback Amendment was found to be valid, submitted to voters, and approved by voters, and it is now currently incorporated into our Illinois Constitution. Now, what analysis can we gain from this case law? The Cutback petition and the term limits petition are distinguishable from one another. This is because the Cutback petition changes existing language of the legislative article, whereas the term limits petition adds in new language and introduces an idea that is not covered in our current Illinois Constitution. The article for the term limits petition language to be incorporated, it must add a new idea. When this is done, it most likely falls outside the scope of the structural and procedural changes which the petition is restricted to under Article 14, Section 3. Now, what does this mean for the Committee of Legislative Reform petition? Again, to reiterate, the petition calls for a reduction in Senate seats from 59 to 41, an increase in House seats from 118 to 123, and an 8-year term limit. This petition is interesting because it combines cutback term limit language with the voter petition term limits language found in Chicago Bar Association. However, it is still a glaring outlier that the term limits language adds language to the legislative article that is not currently incorporated in our Constitution. A voter petition must serve as a constitutional replace button and not introduce new ideas into the legislative article. Based on previous Supreme Court case law, it is likely that the Committee for Legislative Reform petition will be invalid. Now, one issue the court could address is whether or not it would want to dissect this voter petition and preserve the cutback amendment language and discard the likely term limits language. This would leave voters simplified, with the reduction in Senate seats from 59 to 41 and an increase in House seats from 118 to 123. The term limits language could potentially be discarded. There is no Illinois Supreme Court guiding case law on this issue. However, when we go back and look at how a voter petition becomes valid in the first place, it requires voter signatures and voter assent to the content of the petition. If the court then took the petition, dissected it, preserved parts, and discarded parts, voters would be left with a petition that they did not agree to or sign in the first place. Therefore, it is likely that the court will not take this action. I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and especially David Yepsen, Delio Calazari, my supervising attorney, and Dr. Leonard and Dr. Jackson. Thank you very much.
All right, we'll take a few minutes for some questions before we adjourn. You guys don't have a mic over there. There's only one mic. Okay, why don't the three of you come up here and field any questions, all right? And then Bob can... Oh, is there a backup? Okay. Well, stand here and do it. All right, there's a question...
Here, I've got another microphone. This one, just one. Okay. You don't have to identify yourself and ask questions.
Yes, no, please use the mic so people can hear.
Alan Mellis. I was really curious. Assume you're incorrect and these ballot issues get on the ballot and they're passed. At least it's probably directed to Paul because I didn't enjoy your presentation. It's my feeling that when we have cumulative voting in the district, it worked much better. We had a minority representative in the city and also downstate. So my question to you is, in your opinion, which is assuming that these get passed, could by any method what was proposed now in the reconstituting of the assembly be a valid amendment to that what's being proposed today? In other words, if the districts are now three, right now as I understand there to be three representative districts that are all separate. So what I'm saying to you is, would it be constitutionally acceptable to go back to the cumulative voting so you have three representatives at large within that Senate district?
Sir, your question is probably a fantastic one. My research in this subject has been limited to term limits language and the interpretation of the case law. And I fear that if I tried to answer that question, I would not have a good answer for you because I honestly do not know.
So can I give you my card?
Yes, and I would love to do some research for you and get back to you on that issue.
Paul, I'm confused. You make it sound like you cannot add new language. I read the Constitution and it just says it has to be structural and procedural changes. Why is there a prohibition? Where do you see a prohibition in adding new language?
Thank you. The structural so the new language, when I'm trying to make the point of the of the term limits language being new, is that in our current Constitution, there is no language that deals with limits on the term of service of a legislator. This is a new idea to the legislature if you're introducing it via a voter petition, which means that this idea likely becomes a substantive or legislative change to Article 4, which would have to be implemented through the means of Method 1, a constitutional convention, or a General Assembly amendment, which seems unlikely. The cutback amendment, I think when you read between the lines of that decision, the cutback amendment was preserved because, among other changes, the number of legislators is an idea that is already covered in the current Constitution. So they're just kind of swapping out numbers, and the change is just changing structural and procedural elements of the article, and it's not introducing a new thought to the article.
This is a proposal to amend the Constitution.
Wait. If you're gonna get a microphone.
I mean, this is an amendment to amend the Constitution.
Yep.
So you are making changes to it, and the requirement of the Constitution just says that's structural and procedural. I don't follow your logic.
Right. So this is this is a proposed amendment, but it matters on what kind of language you're introducing into the article. So when you read Article 4, Section 2, it does not contain language that deals with the term of service of a legislator. The cutback amendment dealt with language saying that, there's 177 representatives in our legislature, and now we want 118. That's an idea that is flushed out already in the original document that was proposed to be amended. Whereas if we look at our term limits petition, we are dealing with an idea that's not covered in the original document and is being sought to be introduced through the use of a voter petition. And the Article 14, Section 3 method of voter petition is very limited in scope based on what the Supreme Court has told us. Now, I could, of course, be wrong, but it depends on how the Supreme Court justices come out on this issue, and in the past, they have not been favorable to the voter petition for term limits.
Next question. And we have one over here, and that would be Bradley Glenn.
Isn't this kind of like the how long has it been since you stopped beating your wife question? In other words, the fact that there's nothing in the Constitution that says for all elected officials there will be no no limits on the number of terms that you can serve is implied in the Constitution itself. So therefore, the terminology is there by implication. So therefore, changing it to 8 years is not making, is structural and
Right. And that is a great question. So the way that these Supreme Court justices might interpret this statute or constitution is they will probably use statutory interpretation tools. One of them is a canon of construction, which I think makes a lot of sense, and that's expressio unius, which means the inclusion of one idea excludes the inclusion of another. So we have a silent Article 4, Section 2 that doesn't cover term limits at all. There's no, it doesn't say we don't want, current Constitution doesn't say something along the lines of a legislature shall serve for this amount of years and there shall be no term limits. Therefore, we have an article that is silent on the issue. So if the original drafters of Article 4 wanted to include a term limits provision or limiting provision, they would have done so. And the fact that they didn't indicates that it is a concept that wasn't addressed or taken into account in the drafting of the original Article 4, Section 2, which means that to include this language, you're probably stumbling outside the restriction of structural and procedural.
Dave. Thanks, Paul. Dave Cohn, Union Legal. I gather the question of whether or not the proposed amendment represents a structural or procedural change is one we'll have to let the courts weigh in on.
Yep.
I was curious about the issue you raised, which I'd not heard previously, about the possibility that the court might take a look at the proposed petition and, in your words, dissect it, that is, to divide it. Is there precedent in the Illinois case law for such an action, or is that just speculative that the court might consider such a thing to preserve at least a part of the petition to present to voters?
Purely speculative. There's not guiding case law on this. In kind of thinking about this presentation, it's an interesting question that was posed to me by Delio, and he said, is this possibly something the court would split up? Because this cutback amendment language, among other things, I'm simplifying their petition, but the cutback amendment language has been shown to be valid, and the term limits language has shown in previous Supreme Court decisions not to be valid. So that was kind of a novel question that was posed, and I think when you look at the means of how you get a voter petition valid in the first place, it requires voter assent. It's just basic contract law. Know what you're signing. And if voters are signing and supporting a document that has proposals A, B, and C, and all of a sudden the court comes out and supports just A and B, they're preserving a petition that probably wouldn't have been valid in the first place.
Last question.
It's more a complicated question. Wouldn't your analysis be equivalent to, at the federal level, what happened with the federal income tax when it was first overruled by the Supreme Court, how it was later allowed to be instituted, that there wasn't support elements within the Constitution for income tax?
I'm sorry, sir. I'm actually not familiar with that. So you're saying the Constitution was initially silent and then amended to? Yeah. Yep. Sorry. I'm not familiar with that particular case law. That would be a strong argument in favor of the petition being valid. And of course, we don't know what's going to happen with this petition before it comes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court comes out in different ways for different reasons that is hard to predict.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for being here today. On behalf of the Union League Club, the Better Government Association, and the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute, I think you can safely say we did get into the weeds today, and that was what our intention was, and so I thank you for being here. Have a safe journey home.